What happens when months of harassment, fake claims, and endless battles finally end? Not with shouting, but with the slam of a judge's gavel. This is the moment I realized the mountain was finally mine. The night it all came crashing down was like something out of a storm-ridden nightmare. Rain pounded against the steel gate, each drop echoing like a drumbeat as a U-Haul fishtailed to a stop in the mud. Its tires spun uselessly, flinging muck, while Karen's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, screaming at me to open the gate. Thunder rolled across the mountain, booming like cannon fire, nearly drowning her out. Behind her, the sheriff's SUV idled with its red and blue lights slicing through the night, casting long, frantic shadows across the soaked trees. In the cab of the truck, her parents sat huddled together, pale as ghosts. Their eyes darted nervously between the swelling creak and the heavy lock I had just clicked shut with a final, satisfying snap. For one surreal moment, time froze, the key dangling from my hand, the storm raging, and Karen shrieking something about family rights and emergency shelter. 2 months earlier, I had believed this mountain house was my sanctuary, a forgotten retreat where I could breathe and rebuild in peace. But now, standing in the storm with Karen and the sheriff glaring at me through the rain, it felt less like a dream home and more like the stage of an absurd siege. That was the night everything came to a head. But to understand how a simple renovation turned into a standoff on a mountain road, you need to know how this battle truly began. 2 months before the storm, I drove up a winding mountain road in a battered rental truck, following nothing but a tattered paper map and a gut feeling. I was searching for something rare, an old property with secrets still buried in its bones. At the very end of an overgrown path, I found it. The house looked like it had been asleep for decades. The roof sagged under moss, the siding peeled like bark, and the windows were boarded up tight, keeping its history hidden. But to me, it radiated untapped potential. No neighbors, no noise, just silence, except for a few scattered cabins tucked far down the ridge. And there, nailed crookedly to a tree, hung a faded "for sale by owner" sign, half swallowed by moss. I knew instantly I'd stumbled on something special, almost like I'd discovered a forgotten kingdom. The seller was an old logger, weathered and matter-of-fact. He handed me a thin folder, original deeds, maps dating back to the 1950s, and one simple warning: the road's private. Whoever owns the last house maintains it. You'll be on your own. He wanted it sold fast. I paid in cash that same week, my head filled with visions of quiet mornings, sawdust afternoons, and a slow, steady renovation with no one around to bother me. Or so I thought. The very first day I drove up as the new owner, Karen appeared, like a storm cloud on the horizon. She stood at the bend in the road, waving her clipboard like a badge, flagging me down before I could even roll down the window. "This is a community road," she declared. "We have rules up here. We vote on renovations, we vote on overnight stays, we vote on parking." I blinked at her, baffled. So she jabbed a finger at a faded wooden sign nailed to a tree, Mountain Ridge Community Association. She smiled sharply. "I'm the president." I held up the deed, telling her I owned the last parcel. Her only response was a derisive snort. She insisted her parents had always stayed at the house whenever they needed, and that it was tradition. I shrugged it off, thinking she was just eccentric. But by the second week, I realized Karen wasn't eccentric. She was relentless. Every time I brought up a truckload of supplies, she was there, camera in hand, recording me like I was a criminal. She left notes under my windshield wipers about quiet hours and landscape harmony. And when that didn't faze me, she crossed the line, stepping right onto my property to inspect the house, claiming the guest cabin was once a community shelter. That was when I dug deeper into the papers the logger had given me. And buried in the back, I found gold. A surveyor's letter. It certified beyond doubt that the road, the gate, and everything beyond it were private property, owned exclusively by whoever held the deed. The gate was old and rusted, but with a fresh lock and some welding, it could be impenetrable. So I made it my first project. As I set my boots onto the slick porch, my mind slipped back to those first weeks, when the work still felt like a private obsession and Karen's meddling was only a persistent, annoying hum at the edge of everything. I'd arrived with a rented trailer full of lumber and tools, ready to strip decades of rot down to the bones. Mornings began in fog, the kind that slithered through the pines and made the world hush. I'd light a pot of coffee on a camp stove, unroll plans on the scarred oak table, and watch the sun fight its way up the ridge while I sketched the day's work. There was a simple, brutal pleasure in it. Sawdust on my hands, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the steady rhythm of progress. My very first project was the gate. It had been a creaking relic left by loggers, hinges eaten by rust, a frame that sagged when it rained. I tore it down to the posts, set new steel deep into the earth, bolted in heavy brackets, and welded crossbars so nothing could ram it open. I fitted a lock system tied to motion sensors and a battery backup, because storms in these parts like to eat power. I wanted control. I wanted certainty. Karen watched it all from the bend in the road, phone up, filming like evidence. One afternoon she trotted down with a stapled packet of community bylaws, copied on printer paper. No signatures, no authority. She thrust them at me. I photographed the flimsy pages, handed them back, and watched the look in her eyes change. Suddenly I realized I was no longer a new neighbor to be tolerated. I was an obstacle to be removed. As windows went in and porch steps rose, she escalated. Notes under my windshield, quiet hours, complaints left on my doorstep about landscape harmony. Once she produced two men who claimed to be inspectors. They turned out to be lodge buddies. I told them both to leave before I called the sheriff. After that embarrassment, Karen tried a subtler cut, sabotage through my suppliers. The hardware clerk called me one afternoon, voice low. Karen had tried to pose as my project manager and cancel my deliveries. From then on I ordered under a company name and drove into town to pick up my own shipments. It doubled my time, but stripped her leverage. I started carrying a notebook in my back pocket like a talisman. Every encounter, every call, every threat, time-stamped. My lawyer had insisted, document everything. If this blew up, a clean chain of records would be my armor. Nights were for maps and deeds. Under the dim cast of a lantern, I read the old survey again and again. The more I traced the boundary lines, the more the truth sunk in. The private road and its gate belonged, unequivocally, to the parcel at the top. No easements, no public right-of-way. A 30-year-old affidavit from a surveyor was the nail in the coffin. The road was legally sealed to anyone but the top parcel's owner. With every nail I drove and bolt I tightened, ownership deepened from paper into flesh. The place stopped feeling borrowed and began to feel like mine. Then Karen tried the moral angle. One morning while I was fitting beams in the guest house, she appeared at the foot of the hill and announced her parents had been displaced and needed the cabin for a few days. When I refused, she raised her voice until it cracked, brandishing community and compassion like weapons. I stood my ground and she left promising a complaint. 2 days later, a county inspector did arrive. He walked the property, scratched his head, and ultimately muttered that Karen had a reputation for filing trouble. He also mentioned, almost casually, that she had tried to submit paperwork to convert the road to public access but had been denied because of the recorded deed. That detail changed everything. She wasn't merely a meddler. She was actively attempting to rewrite the rules to suit her family. I responded like I always do, meticulously and loudly. I made duplicates of every document, filed one set with my lawyer, and began placing cameras at every bend and entry point. Motion lights were added, hardwired where possible. I repainted blazes on trees and drove iron stakes along the boundary with a surveyor's GPS so there would be no question where my land ended. The renovation folded into a different kind of project, one equal parts construction and fortification. Still, I took satisfaction in the work. Sanding floors late into the dusk, painting with a kind of quiet fury, fixing the chimney so smoke would carry right again. These acts felt like reclaiming the past. But outside my rhythm, Karen's tactics grew stranger. Fake letterhead notices demanding dues and meetings, flyers about shared access left on my porch, staged complaints dropped at the clerk's office. I burned one stack of her flyers and fed the embers to the night. Contractors who'd been on the fence began siding with me once they'd seen how weak her threats were. One of them handed me a voicemail of Karen berating him at the bottom of the road for daring to work on her mountain. We laughed then, but it was a hard laugh. It steeled me. The community's mood shifted slowly in my favor. The mail carrier started delivering without comment. The hardware owner waved me in like a friend. Even the sheriff, when I ran into him in town, offered a tired grin and a card. "She's been at it again, right?" That small-town solidarity did more than ease a worry. It built momentum. By the time I closed the week out, the house felt different. New wiring hummed underfoot. The well ran clear. The guest room had a bed that didn't groan. More than that, the property felt defended. When I draped a heavy steel chain across the access road and bolted the gate one evening, it was more than practical, it was declarative. The era of open access was over. I went to bed that night listening to wind in the pines and the even pulse of the creek, convinced I'd bought us a few weeks of peace. I didn't know then that Karen had already set plans in motion. Trucks were being booked, sympathetic stories whispered to older parents, a U-Haul on standby. All I felt was the low electric hum of preparedness, and the sense that if she came again, this time I'd be ready. Morning came with thin light slicing through the trees and the soft, unmistakable feeling that something was moving beneath the surface. I stood on the porch, scanning the line of pines, and for the first time in weeks I didn't flinch when I heard distant engines. I simply tightened my grip on the mug of coffee and waited. By then, my days had settled into a strange rhythm. Construction in the daylight, countermeasures at night. I rebuilt floors, patched plumbing, hammered beams. Then, by lamplight, filled notebooks with dates, times, and Karen's latest attempts to chip away at the life I was carving for myself. This was no longer just a renovation. It was a chess match. The third chapter of this saga truly began when Karen's quiet pressure campaign started to bare its teeth. She'd been working angles for weeks, whispering to neighbors, phoning suppliers, filing paperwork in county offices, all designed to grind my life on the ridge to a halt. I'd already discovered her failed attempt to register my private road as a public right-of-way. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. She spread lies in town, painting me as a squatter who bribed the old logger. She called inspectors claiming I was tearing down protected structures. She even tried to rally locals with talk of taking back the mountain. The first real hit came when a lumber shipment simply didn't show. When I called the yard, they told me the order had been canceled. By me. It was the third time in 2 weeks. I drove down myself, loaded the boards, and told the manager, "From now on, call me directly. No one cancels but me." It meant more sweat and hours, but it starved Karen of one of her sharpest tools. Later, I learned she'd been telling contractors I planned to build a private resort, an outsider stealing hunting land from locals. One evening, a man even approached me in the diner with that story. When I pulled out the deed and showed him my renovation sketches, he laughed. "She's got an imagination. I'll give her that." Her lies began to collapse under their own weight. My credibility grew, hers cracked. But instead of slowing down, her obsession escalated. Meanwhile, the house itself was transforming. New beams held the roof steady. The fireplace drafted cleanly for the first time in decades. The guest house, once blackened with mold, now glowed with fresh drywall and the warm hum of a wood stove. Every nail I sank into the frame wasn't just construction, it was a claim, a declaration that I belonged here, that this mountain was mine, no matter how loudly she screamed otherwise. Still, the siege feeling never left. Sheriff Daniels's card stayed taped above my desk, a quiet reminder of the stakes. He called me one afternoon, half amused, half exasperated. Karen had marched into his office accusing me of elder abuse for not housing her parents. "Document everything," he warned. "She's hoping you'll slip. Give her grounds for a restraining order. Don't take the bait." So I documented. I saved texts, archived voicemails, uploaded every gate camera clip to the cloud. I even placed a hidden trail camera halfway down the road. The footage I caught one foggy morning made me laugh out loud. Karen pacing at the gate with a tape measure, scribbling notes in a little notebook. She looked less like a neighbor and more like a burglar planning a heist. Then came her boldest stunt yet. A county clerk I'd befriended phoned me in private. Karen had filed another petition. Not for the road this time, but to designate my guest house as a community storm shelter, citing historic use. The filing was flimsy at best, but it revealed the depths of her obsession. My lawyer filed a counterstatement before it even hit a hearing. By now, the courthouse had an entire drawer labeled with her filings, and my rebuttals stacked right beside them. Amid the madness, there were moments of dark comedy. A freelance reporter called one morning asking if I was the man who had evicted an elderly couple from their ancestral mountain home. Karen had fed them the story. I calmly emailed the deed, photos, and the survey. Within the hour, the reporter apologized. I printed that email and pinned it to the fridge as a trophy, proof of how far she'd go and how easily the truth unraveled her narrative. But the constant battles took their toll. I had bought this house for silence, not for war. Some nights, I sat on the porch, staring at the gate glinting in the moonlight, wondering if it was worth it, if selling would be easier. But then I remembered the first time I laid eyes on the cabin, the way it called to me like a secret waiting to be claimed, and the logger's firm handshake, sealing the deal. No, this was mine. I wasn't leaving. Resolve hardened into strategy. If she spread a rumor, I countered with facts. If she tampered with supplies, I built redundancies. If she filed paperwork, I filed first. By late summer, even some of her allies were peeling away. Contractors refused her calls. Suppliers rolled their eyes at her name. Sheriff Daniels made a point of driving past the gate once a week. The tide, slowly but surely, was turning. And yet Karen wouldn't quit. Her obsession seemed bottomless. She left strange offerings at the gate. A basket of apples one week, a handwritten poem about community unity the next. I let them rot or let the raccoons deal with them. It was theater, nothing more. Then came the night she laid her cards bare. I had just finished wiring a backup generator when I saw her car idling at the bend. Phone raised. I walked down calmly, stood at the gate while she filmed. "You're going to regret this," she shouted. "My parents are coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." I didn't argue. I just pointed to the lock and smiled. That night, I reviewed every line of defense. The gate, solid. Cameras, live. Sheriff, informed. Food and fuel stocked. Guest house bolted tight. She could bring her parents, she could bring a circus, but she wouldn't bring them past my gate. What I didn't yet know was that she'd already booked the truck. Already spun her parents a story about returning to their mountain home. Already chosen the storm as her stage. All I knew was that the whisper war was over. The collision was coming. And for the first time, I was ready for it. Her pressure campaign was never meant to crush me in one blow. It was a war of erosion, an endless drip meant to wear down my resolve until I finally gave up. But it failed. Every complaint had backfired, every rumor exposed, every false report shut down. And that meant one thing: the next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be direct, obvious. And when it came, I intended to be ready. By then, every camera was tested, every document filed, every lock secured. I had built my defenses like a soldier bracing for siege. Somewhere below, Karen was weaving her final plan. But up here on the ridge, the mountain house stood firm, and so did I, waiting for the storm that was already gathering behind the scenes. As autumn crept closer, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. The air sharpened, the creek ran low, and every sound carried farther in the stillness. And in that silence, Karen's tactics shifted. The rumors and sabotage fell away. Now she wore a new mask, the martyr. It began one misty morning with a knock at the gate. Her car idled just beyond the steel posts, exhaust curling in the damp air. Her voice carried up the gravel road, trembling with rehearsed sorrow. Her parents had been evicted. They were frail. They needed shelter immediately. I stayed on the porch, letting the cameras capture every word. My stomach sank because I realized then she had chosen her stage. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was theater. I walked down slowly, boots crunching against wet gravel. When she saw me, she launched into a performance about community traditions, about how the previous owner had always welcomed her family in storms. She pressed a hand to her chest, casting quick glances at the cameras, and whispered, "We're talking about elderly people here." I answered calmly, firmly. I was sympathetic, but the property was private. Her parents were not welcome to move in. Her tone snapped instantly from sorrow to fury. She pointed at the freshly shingled guest house roof glinting in the sun and demanded, "Why did you fix it if not for guests? You're heartless." I didn't rise to it. She tore off in a spray of gravel, shouting that she'd return with proof. 2 days later, a county inspector trudged up my drive, clipboard in hand. He admitted Karen had filed yet another unsafe conditions complaint. He checked the beams, the wiring, the siding. Then he shook his head, signed the paper, and handed me a clean bill. "Off the record," he said quietly, "she's filed similar complaints on half the valley. It's a pattern. She's even been sniffing around about emergency occupancy permits." That was the moment it clicked. She wasn't just harassing me. She was laying bureaucratic traps, trying to pry open a legal loophole that could let her force her parents into the guest house. I called my lawyer that same afternoon. He filed a cease and desist with the county, a paper wall against her paper war. Meanwhile, the renovations continued like a drumbeat beneath the tension. Each day I hammered nails, ran wiring, and painted trim. The house was no longer a ruin. It was alive, strong, bright, but every improvement only seemed to fuel her obsession. She left voicemails declaring, "We'll be up Friday to settle my parents in." She mailed me old family photos, picnics by the creek, decades ago, as if nostalgia equaled ownership. She even dropped off a handwritten tenancy agreement at the gate, with her parents' names on it, and signed. Delusional, chilling. One evening, as I worked on the porch railing, headlights flickered at the bend. Her car idled for a long minute. I killed my drill and listened. When she finally backed down the hill, the cameras caught her snapping photos of the gate, the lock, the signs. Felt less like a neighbor and more like reconnaissance. And yet, beyond her obsession, the mountain itself was serene. Deer grazed at dawn. Hawks wheeled in the sky. The creek whispered in its bed. The contrast was surreal. Paradise wrapped in siege. Contractors joked that I was turning the place into a fortress. One said, "Most people would have cracked by now." Their respect kept me steady. I built rituals into my defense, walking the perimeter at night, flashlight in hand, checking locks every morning with a thermos of coffee. Little things that gave me control. Still, Karen escalated. The sheriff called one evening, his tone weary. She had filed yet another complaint, this time accusing me of threatening her with weapons. He sighed, said he figured it wasn't true, but had to log it. "She's building a narrative," he warned. "Don't give her anything. Keep documenting." His words were a lifeline. That night, I doubled my camera coverage, angles overlapping, gates in full view. I reinforced the guest house door with a deadbolt and locked the keys in a safe box. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to be living in a fantasy where her parents already belonged here. And then came the final warning. An email, blunt and chilling. "We will be moving my parents in as planned. Consider this your notice." My lawyer fired back with a formal reply, but I doubted she even read it. She had crossed beyond reason, beyond negotiation. The night before the storm, I walked the property with a flashlight. The air was sharp, the mountain tilting toward winter. Every lock glinted in the beam of my light. And as I stood there, I could see it all unfolding like a script. The moving truck, her parents in tow, the confrontation at the gate. It should have made me anxious, but instead it steadied me, because this time I knew exactly what was coming. This was my land, legally, morally, and by every shred of proof I had gathered. I had fortified it not only with wood and steel, but with patience, records, and the discipline to let her undo herself. And when the day finally came, when engines growled up the mountain road, when Karen tried to cross the line in full daylight, I was ready. The last quiet hours before it happened felt strangely calm. I sat on the porch with coffee in hand, mist curling around the new fence posts, listening to the forest breathe. I had come here to renovate a house. But the mountain had been teaching me something else, about boundaries, about resolve, and about how far some people will go when they believe entitlement outweighs ownership. Storm clouds gathered at the horizon, both literal and symbolic. The next chapter would not be about sawdust or paint. It would be about a siege. The morning broke gray, the sky the color of steel. Before I could even pour a cup of coffee, my phone buzzed. Motion alert from the gate camera. I tapped the feed and froze. A caravan was winding up the road. First Karen's sedan. Then a U-Haul looming tall against the pines. Behind it, a car with two older figures in the backseat, her parents. Even through the grainy lens, I could feel the weight of it. A parade of entitlement rolling toward my locked gate. I pulled on my boots, zipped my jacket, made sure my phone was recording, and walked down the drive as a fine mist lifted from the wet ground. Every step felt heavy. The hum of tires below sounded like thunder that didn't belong to the storm. By the time I reached the gate, they were already there. Karen stood in the rain like a general about to demand surrender. Her parents sat pale and bewildered in the back seat, eyes fixed on the guest house roof that gleamed through the trees. The U-Haul blocked the road like it could simply erase the word private. She saw me and shouted, voice sharp enough to cut through the idling engines. I had to open up. Her parents were tired. This had all been settled. I stayed on my side of the gate, letting the cameras capture every second. Her parents cracked the window, and in their faces I saw it. Confusion, hope, and the unmistakable belief that they truly were returning to a place that belonged to them. Karen had fed them a fantasy. The U-Haul driver looked from me to Karen, clearly wondering what kind of mess he'd driven into. I lifted a hand, pointed to the private road sign, the chain, the lock. My voice stayed calm. This was not their shelter. Behind her, the sky darkened. Clouds spilled over the ridge like smoke. And then, at the bend, the sheriff's SUV appeared, lights flashing once before settling into a steady pulse. For a beat, the whole scene froze. The law had arrived. Karen whirled on him, gesturing wildly, demanding he force me to comply. But he stayed in the car, watching, unmoved. The first drops of rain slapped against the dust. The U-Haul spun its wheels, sliding a few inches toward the ditch. Her parents shouted at her, panic in their voices. The driver shook his head. He wasn't risking a mudslide for anyone. I stepped forward so her parents could see me clearly. I told them there was shelter at the base of the mountain, 15 minutes away. If they wanted, the sheriff could escort them himself. The older man's eyes flicked from me to his daughter, and I saw the first crack of doubt. The sheriff finally stepped out, pulled up his hood, and said flatly, "This is private property. She's been warned. Move the vehicles before the road gives out." Karen sputtered, shouting about heritage and emergencies, but her words were swallowed by thunder. The sheriff turned to me. "Do you want to file a trespass complaint?" I shook my head. "I just want them down safe before the storm traps them." That answer seemed to calm the parents, while enraging Karen. Lightning ripped the sky open. Thunder rolled across the ridge like a cannon blast. The older woman snapped at the driver to back up. The U-Haul roared, wheels spitting mud, then lurched free and began its retreat. The parents' car followed, their faces pale, the old man's gaze locking on me with something between apology and exhaustion. Karen lingered, soaked, furious, shouting that this wasn't over. But when the sheriff's hand touched her shoulder, even she knew the battle was lost. I stood at the gate as their tail lights vanished into the mist. Rain dripped from my jacket, the lock cold in my hand. The mountain roared with water, the creek below swollen into a torrent. And in that storm, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Because the gate had held, the law had held, and the parents had been spared being stranded in her fantasy. That night, the house glowed against the storm, fresh windows catching the flash of lightning, walls standing solid against the wind. It wasn't just a renovation anymore. It was a declaration. This land had order now, and that order began and ended at the locked gate where Karen's illusions drowned in rain and mud. I exhaled deeply, feeling the storm's residue lift from my chest. For the first time in months, the mountain returned to its natural rhythm. Quiet, vast, and unbothered. Yet beneath the calm, I knew Karen's silence was temporary. That image of her retreating caravan would stay etched in my mind, proof that entitlement, no matter how loud, folds against fact, law, and steel. Night fell like a curtain after the storm, the scent of wet pine hanging heavy in the air for days. But inside me, adrenaline still pulsed. Karen's absence wasn't peace, it was a pause. The kind of stillness that comes before the next round. Every morning, before coffee, I scanned the cameras. No headlights on the road, no figures creeping along the tree line, but always I searched. I replayed the storm footage over and over, studying it like a chess match. Her parents' dawning doubt, the sheriff's steady refusal, her unraveling facade. Watching the collapse of her narrative in real time reminded me just how far someone will go when their fantasy collides with reality. Meanwhile, the house stood strong. Fresh paint dried into armor. The guest cabin was sealed, the generator humming like a guard dog. Even the contractors who had seen the showdown stopped by with congratulations, half joking that I should start charging admission. But beneath their humor, I caught a new respect. What was once a decaying relic had become a fortress, not of walls alone, but of patience and proof. Karen vanished for a week. No phone calls, no car at the bend, just silence. Then the county clerk rang. She'd filed for an emergency injunction, accusing me of elder endangerment during the storm. A desperate swing. The judge tossed it instantly, but the clerk's tone told me all I needed. She was unraveling, and faster than before. I hung up, irritation burning off into resolve. This wasn't chaos, it was rehearsal. Each attempt a blueprint for escalation. So I hardened my defenses. Night patrols around the perimeter, flashlight cutting the mist, every lock checked twice. I installed a new sensor along the back trail where she might try to bypass the gate. Out there, under the stars, I felt like both hunter and hunted, my boots crunching twigs in the silence. Her next move wasn't a truck, it was letters. 3 envelopes, each from supposed advocates, demanding I open my property for her parents. Different names, same script. I recognized her hand in every line. I sent them straight to my lawyer. Another entry in the harassment file. Still, I didn't lash out. I documented. The sheriff even called me one evening, his voice carrying quiet fatigue. "You're doing this right. Stay steady." His words settled into me like steel. That week, I commissioned a local metalworker to fabricate a crossbar for the gate. A slab of steel so heavy it took 3 men to set it. Anchored in concrete, welded into permanence. The gate was no longer just protection, it was a declaration. The day after it went in, Karen's car appeared at the bend. She didn't step out. She just sat there, engine running, staring at the house like she could will it into surrender. When she finally drove off, the hair on my neck stood straight. It wasn't retreat, it was reconnaissance. Calls trickled in from town. Acquaintances said she was venting, promising vengeance, talking about betrayal. Some warned she might drag reporters up here, or stage another emergency. I thanked them, returned to work, but every nail I drove felt like another line in my defense. At night, my journal became a siege diary. Dates, times, phone calls, sightings. Each page a record of her obsession and my resolve. Still, amid the siege, the mountain comforted me. Deer by the creek, hawks wheeling over ridges, stars so sharp they felt like frost in the sky. The house itself was transforming beneath my hands. Every plank and board wasn't just renovation, it was ownership made tangible. And slowly, the tide shifted. The sheriff had a harassment record logged. The clerk flagged her attempts before they landed. Contractors refused to deal with her. Even her allies in town began stepping back, embarrassed by her persistence. Her story was fraying. Mine was hardening, but I didn't mistake the silence for surrender. Cornered delusion is unpredictable. So I kept building my contingencies, automatic off-site uploads of camera footage, drafted statements for press, fuel and food stocked for storms. Each preparation gave me control, a way to turn frustration into strategy. And beneath it all, I felt something strange. Not triumph, not hatred, a flicker of pity. Her parents had looked broken that night at the gate, confused passengers in a fantasy they never authored. I often wondered if, in the days after their retreat, they had asked her hard questions. Did they finally begin to see through her story, or did they cling to it, afraid of what admitting the truth might mean? I'd never know. But sometimes, when the wind carried voices up from the valley, I imagined their doubt echoing in those currents, fading like ghosts of a past that never was. Autumn wrapped the mountain in gold and steel-blue air. What had started as a renovation project had become something far more, a fortress. The guest house was sealed tight, the main house nearly finished, the gate now a sculpted wall of iron and resolve. Karen's attacks had forced me to build faster, sharper, stronger. In the process, the house had been transformed, and so had I. Patience had become armor, vigilance a way of life. For weeks, there was no confrontation, only silence. But it was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that vibrates like a taut string before it snaps. Karen wasn't gone. She was planning. I could feel her just beyond the ridge, plotting her return. Chapter 7 didn't begin with headlights on the gravel or shouting at my gate. It began with a call from my lawyer. A process server had delivered a new tactic, a claim of historic easement rights, naming me as an unlawful occupant. My lawyer read the complaint aloud with dry amusement. Karen was demanding that the court grant her family permanent access across my land, as if it were a public road. Anger hit first. Relief followed close behind. At least now the battlefield was visible, formal. No more whispers or surprise convoys. Just paper, ink, and evidence. That afternoon we assembled everything. Deeds, surveys, inspection reports, photographs. Stacked into a binder heavier than a brick, every page tabbed, dated, irrefutable. I sent copies to the sheriff and county clerk. No one would be able to claim ignorance. But Karen wasn't done. A week later the sheriff called, still half laughing as he told me she'd tried filing a tenancy claim for her parents, listing my address. It was absurd, but also revealing. Her delusion had gone beyond strategy. It had become her reality. His voice grew serious as he told me an injunction for harassment was already in motion. Months of documentation had built to this moment. Soon, the law itself would draw the boundary she refused to see. I took to standing at the gate each evening, palm resting on the cold steel crossbar, imagining the day she would be served her own papers here, at the barrier she had never breached. The house behind me gleamed with completion. Floors sealed, paint cured, guest house furnished, barn roof repaired, firewood stacked like defenses waiting for winter. This wasn't just a renovation anymore. It was a monument to ownership. The hearing came on a gray morning. Karen arrived at the courthouse with her parents in tow, clutching binders of photocopies and printouts. Maps from the internet, papers without weight. My lawyer and I sat across from them, our binders stacked like a wall between truth and fiction. She spun her tale. Ancestral rights, family caretaking, emergencies, traditions. It spilled out in a rush, a story stitched together from scraps. Then our turn came. My lawyer laid out the chain of title, the surveys, the sheriff's reports, the inspector's signatures, 70 years of documented fact. The judge flipped slowly through the pages, then looked over her glasses at Karen. This property is not yours. This road is not yours. The gavel fell with a soft thud, but in my chest it landed like thunder. A door slamming shut on decades of entitlement. Her parents sagged beside her, stricken, eyes darting from the judge to me, as if only then realizing the extent of the lie they'd been fed. Before I left, my lawyer slid the injunction paperwork to the clerk. By sunset, Karen was legally barred from harassing me, from filing false claims, from approaching the gate without legitimate cause. It was the moment I had been building toward since the day she waved fake bylaws in my face. But there was no celebration, no victory cry. Driving back up the mountain, the autumn leaves blurred past my windshield, bright but brittle, like the exhaustion in my chest. I paused at the gate, unlocked it, and rolled through slowly. The fight had demanded so much energy, energy that should have gone into living, not defending. That night I sat on the porch, stars burning cold above, coffee steaming in my hands. The injunction meant protection. The court ruling meant no more phantom petitions, no more false inspectors. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine peace. But the story hadn't fully ended. A few nights later, I saw her car at the bend again. Headlights off, engine idling, a shadow in the mist. She didn't step out. She just sat there, staring up at the house she could never touch, before rolling away into darkness. It wasn't rage I felt watching her. It was something quieter. The strange, sad pity. The sheriff came by a few days later with the official copy of the injunction. He congratulated me softly, saying he'd rarely seen someone endure so much harassment with so much restraint. We stood together at the edge of the porch, sipping coffee, looking down at the locked gate. He told me the community had turned against her, that even her old allies were filing complaints now. As dusk spread across the valley, I switched on the new lights lining the driveway. They glowed through the trees like a procession of lanterns, marking the way home. And for the first time since I'd set foot on this mountain, it felt wholly, undeniably mine. Inside, the warmth from the wood stove reached every corner, flickering across freshly painted walls, and I thought about how far I'd come since the day I first unfolded that tattered map. The locked gate still stood below, but now it was more than defense. It was a marker of boundaries hard-earned and kept. This chapter ended not with sirens or shouting, but with the quiet weight of a court order and the glow of new lights along an old mountain road. Winter settled in as a hush, not a storm. Snow softened the branches, muffled the creek into a low hum beneath the ice. In that stillness, the burden of past months finally began to lift. The house, once hollow and uncertain, now radiated warmth, its windows glowing amber against the snow. The guest house stood firm. The gate below glittered in frost like a silent sentinel. Karen vanished. No more cars idling at the bend. No voicemails. No filings. It was as if she'd been erased from the valley, though I knew she was somewhere below rewriting her version of events. Her parents sent a shaky, handwritten letter of apology, an unexpected coda to months of deception. Contractors returned without hesitation, finishing the last details. A stone path, a new balcony rail, even a wood-fired hot tub. Each addition was a stitch closing the wound, turning the house from fortress back into home. Still, vigilance lingered. For weeks, I checked the cameras at dawn, walked the perimeter at dusk, startled at small noises. But slowly, the mountain itself taught me to release the habit. Deer pawed through snow beneath the apple trees. Hawks reclaimed their perches. The thawing creek sounded less like a warning and more like a lullaby. One morning, coffee in hand, I realized I had not thought about Karen for a full hour. It felt like unlocking a room inside my own mind. With the house complete, I welcomed a few close friends. We cooked on the wood stove, laughed by the fire, marveled at the snug guest house Karen had once tried to claim. Some teased me about renting it out, but I wasn't ready to let strangers cross that threshold. The gate remained locked, more symbol than necessity. Sometimes, standing there at dusk, I remembered the mud-choked convoy, the sheriff's lights, Karen's shouts fading into rain. Not bitterness, just a marker of how far I'd come. In town, the story shifted. People who once believed Karen now admitted their own brushes with her demands. The sheriff greeted me on Main Street with a smile. "Looks like you've tamed the ridge." Even the county inspector came with the final certificate of occupancy, staying for coffee, marveling at how solid the house felt. That night, by the fire, I reflected on the irony. I came here to rebuild a house, but ended up rebuilding my own patience. The siege had shaped me as much as wood and stone shaped the home. As snow deepened, I formed a new ritual. Each morning, I walked to the ridge's edge, looking down at the valley shrouded in fog. In that vast silence, I felt both small and strong. A single figure who had held firm until truth caught up. The mountains seemed to nod in recognition. By spring, the snow retreated, birdsong returned, and the mountain house stood proud and alive. Friends again asked if I would open the guest house as a retreat, and for the first time I considered it. Maybe one day. For now, it was mine alone, a private proof of endurance. I began writing again, not about battles, but about boundaries and persistence, about how building something of your own will always test you. The mountain gave me back my words as surely as it gave me a home. And so Chapter 8 closed not with drama but with peace. The peace I had dreamed of when I first saw that moss-covered for sale sign. One late winter night, I sat wrapped in a blanket on the balcony, stars sharp above the ridge, the gate glinting under moonlight. No longer a barricade, but a threshold. No longer just defense, but a beginning. The house smelled of cedar and would smoke, warm and alive. For the first time since it all began, I locked the door behind me. Not from fear, but from habit, knowing that the mountain and I had finally found our balance at last.